Hi, I'm Mike Humphrey, and this is Philosophy 100. If we were live and you were here and I could talk to you, I think I'd want to ask you why? Why philosophy? Why are you taking philosophy? And I know the official answers that are given all the time. There's the word philosophy comes from two Greek words, philo, meaning love, and sophia, wisdom or knowledge. And so philosophy literally means the love of knowledge. I would like to think that that's why you're here. Um, People who've given their reasons for studying philosophy, they tend to say things like they learn better how to use logic and reason to analyze human experience, and that means your experience, the life that you're actually living. My emphasis on the class will be on doing philosophy, which doing philosophy is mostly a matter of asking questions and then pursuing better and better answers to them. Um, Other people have said that learning philosophy is a way to learn critical thinking, close reading, clear writing, and logical analysis. And that's true. It is one of the better ways to learn those things. And those things are valuable almost everywhere. They're valuable in the workplace. Employers want employees who can think critically and read carefully and write accurately and precisely and who can analyze things. All of those I have a focus on language, and philosophy is mainly about language. We think about concepts almost entirely in language. It's true that some thought is visual, as like when you're learning, um, to carve a flute or something. A lot of it is visualizing. Some of it's auditory. Certainly, musicians aren't thinking about words primarily when they're performing. But when we're thinking about the big problems we face in life, or trying to answer the big questions, the work is almost entirely in language. And so the best way to learn to use language well, I think, is to combine close reading, paying attention to what other writers have done, and practice writing. And so we'll get some practice writing in this course. And I don't want you to be scared or intimidated by that. I'm assuming you're here because you're interested in the big questions. Um, what makes a question big? I think the answer to that is sort of big questions are the ones that focus in on the stuff that really matters in life. Um, Part of the reason I like teaching in the liberal arts, literature, philosophy, journalism, that sort of thing, is that sometimes I think that classrooms are almost the only place left in America where people talk about the real stuff. I mean, what are they really thinking about? What are they really wondering about? What are they really worried about? Um, and so I'm looking forward to this class. I'll try to figure out some alternatives to discussion since we're all scattered. Um, in classes that discuss great literature or philosophical questions, the discussion is often a hugely important part of the learning. It's taking a stab at articulating what you're thinking in a room full of friends. I mean, people who are on your side. It's not a contest. Um, can be really helpful. And then hearing other people's perspectives on the same text can be powerfully educative. I'll try to figure out some ways to create that kind of community as we go along, and I really hope you'll help with that. I really invite you to get involved with the class. So I haven't got a lot of background with this technology I'm using, so I'll probably putz around for a while. Keep in mind as the class unfolds, if you have suggestions about what we can do better, what might work better for you, share them with me. I I'm doing what I know how to do at the moment, but I'm not opposed at all to trying some other things. So there's some information about me. My name, Michael Humphrey, and at skc.edu. There's an underscore between my first name and the last name that kind of disappears since the computer turned the whole thing into a link, but it's Michael underscore Humphrey at skc.edu. My phone number is 406-370-4369. And I'm planning, I would like you to feel welcome to get in touch with me and so that we can meet somewhere on campus, socially distanced and or wearing masks, whatever the rules are at that point. I'm not clear yet how any of that works. I need to get some more information from the department. Jared, I was just asked to do this job a couple of days ago, so I'm kind of scrambling, playing catch up, which, that's sort of the way school is, isn't it? Um, so that question, why philosophy? This is from the University of Washington Philosophy Department. Students who learn philosophy get a great many benefits from doing so. The tools taught by philosophy are of great use in further education and employment. Um, and this is sort of repeating what I've already said. Um, but these are some statements about students who've gone through a philosophy program again at the University of Washington. It was philosophy where I learned rigorous critical thinking, a skill that is invaluable when creating art, from Donald Daedalus. Philosophy taught me to think critically and was a perfect major for law school. Yeah, law school is mainly about verbal logic, and that's what philosophy is about also. Um, uh, Philosophy is very useful for assessing ethical issues. I really think that philosophy excels at spotting errors in people's thinking. That can't be right for reasons of logic or evidence. But that's important with ethical questions. It's really important to be able to know for a certainty that some positions are wrong. So Aubrey Batchelor said the courses I took for a minor in philosophy have provided a valuable framework for my career work in the field of global health and have given me a strong foundation for developing a structured logical arguments in various contexts. Medical ethics is actually a big part of modern philosophy because our medical technology is in some ways getting ahead of our understanding of wisdom. I mean, what should we be doing? We developed the ability to do things before we've developed enough philosophy to answer clearly, well, should we do them just because we can? The ability to apply an ethical framework to questions that have developed in my career in taking care of patients has been a gift and something that I value, says Natalie Nunes. And philosophy provides intellectual resources, critical and creative thinking capacity that are indispensable for success in contemporary international security environment. Richard Paz. It's very helpful for understanding others' perspectives. Philosophy grounds us in an intelligent tradition, larger than our own personal opinions. And I think that's hugely important. We will talk about some specific philosophers in this course, certainly the first ones, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greece. Socrates wasn't really the first philosopher, but he changed things so dramatically that all of the philosophers before Socrates are just lumped together as pre-Socratics. Um, Alfred North Whitehead said that all of philosophy in the Western tradition, all of philosophy consists of footnotes to Plato. Plato and Socrates are in some ways the same character. So when I talk about Plato, I'm talking about Socrates. The way that works is really simple. Socrates didn't believe in writing things down, and he didn't write anything down. After he was killed by the people of Athens for being annoying, his student Plato wrote a lot, and he wrote in the form of dramatic dialogues, which included Socrates and whoever he was talking to. And almost everything that Socrates wrote, he presents through the character of almost everything that Plato wrote, he presents through the character of Socrates in his dialogues. Um, anyway, we will deal with those philosophers. We will deal with a few others, and I'll talk more later on about the whole structure of the class. But getting access, getting introduced to a powerful intellectual tradition is part of what I think should go on in an introductory philosophy class. And then David Preston says, comprehensive exposure to numerous alternative world ethical views has helped me with my daily interaction with all types of people of ethnic, cultural, and political orientation backgrounds. And of course, writing. Uh, Philosophy is about truth, which means the writing, the more accurate and precise it is, the more likely it's going to contain some truth. So that's sort of just sort of what we're going to be doing. But I think the most important reason for studying philosophy, and the reason I suspect you're here, is that we all face big questions in life, and some people are more interested in them than others. But we all have to face the questions that philosophers wrestle with. Do our senses accurately describe reality? Do I know what's really going on in this situation? What is it that makes wrong actions wrong? Why should we not do this or that? And Socrates' favorite question, how should we live? Or as he would have phrased it, what is the good life? A life of goodness. What is it? How do we recognize it? How should we be living? If you visualize the development of consciousness as a series of concentric circles in which we're moving out from that egocentric viewpoint, which very young people, babies, have to have. They can only see the world from their point of view and through the senses they have, and but as we grow up, we move from that world of senses into the culture that surrounds us. And the culture at the beginning, it's our parents are probably just the most important representative of that culture. But what things does the culture judge right and wrong, good and bad? There's a lot of tool making, tool using, music, folk wisdom, sayings. I mean, we largely become who we are because we're shaped, because humans are always come into the world embedded in a culture, and the process of growing up is the process of sort of being shaped and guided by that culture. Um, Philosophy and science is like another rung out there. Both philosophy and science are somewhat neutral on culture. It's still there, but they're trying to get an objective stance. I mean, what is true always and everywhere, not just within my culture. A lot of cultures judge some things right that other cultures judge wrong. Philosophy and science are trying to get more universal answers. For example, gravity works the same everywhere. It doesn't matter what culture we were raised up in, the rules of gravity will make sense. And there are certainly, beginning with Socrates, there are many philosophers who believe the ethical questions do have real right answers. It's not all just whatever seems right to me, but we'll get into that a lot more later on. Um, the outer rung, the outer rung is religious and metaphysical experiences that we can have, and there really isn't like a hard fast line between philosophy and religion. It's kind of a gradual terrain, but when Plentycoo, the Crow war chief, fasts and goes up on a mountaintop and prays, and eventually is given a vision of how his people need to deal with the trouble they're facing at that time, which had a lot to do with the invasion of settlers. The world was changing, and Plentycoo uh, received answers not through reason and logic. He received answers directly from the divine or the creator, is what he said. And Socrates often made the same claims. Socrates actually said the most important things he knew for sure, and he didn't know very many things for sure, but he knew quite a lot about love, and he learned it from the divine. He didn't learn it using philosophy. He didn't talk about that sort of thing very much because he was interested in what he could teach, and he could teach the rules of logic and evidence and reason, uh, teaching how to have inspiration from the gods. He didn't seem to think that was very teachable, and so to a great extent he didn't. So what will we do with the class? It's a little general because I just started working on this course, and I mean, where we're actually going to go, there's a little bit of open-endedness in that because I like to respond to the actual people in a class, and they're always different than the imaginary students we teachers plan for. Certainly, we will look at a few of the most significant philosophers, Socrates and Aristotle, and then others, depending on the direction that starts to seem best. If people are interested in the big conflicts of the present age, I mean, what's going on? What's with the war between the left and the right? Well, one way of getting a more clear picture of that is to trace the left and the right back to their founding philosophers, in a sense. Um, Certainly Machiavelli, who kicks off the modern age with some really interesting arguments. But then John Locke, oh my goodness, I spelled Locke wrong. There should be an E on that. John Locke, who was kind of the basis of the American Revolution to a great extent, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was the philosophical foundation of the French Revolution, which happened just a few years after the American Revolution. Two revolutions, very different approaches, very different processes, and very different outcome. Yeah, but there's so many more. If people are really interested in environmental topics, maybe we could do some work with Aldo Leopold's land ethic. Um, we will also spend some time on logic and logical fallacies, since systematic reason is what separates philosophical discourse from just another bull session. Um, and I will focus on. I said there will be some writing in the class, and it's. I don't want this to sound intimidating now because it won't be when I talk about it. But there's a particular model that I would like to use, which is the CDW model. CDW stands for for claim, data, and warrant. And what these three things are is they are the basis of arguments. Arguments almost always have these three elements. And I'm going to be following a teacher by the name of Stephen Talfin, and he developed the CDW model, and it's sort of the basis of law school. Lawyers, like philosophers, are arguing all the time. Making arguments is what they do. And so focusing in on what are the elements of arguments. You have a good argument nearly has a claim. It has some evidence or data that's supporting that claim, and then it has a warrant, which is connecting the data to the claim and making it all make sense. The warrant, which I'll talk about a lot more, but that's where the real work of an argument comes from. You probably, if you have been taught writing in high school, you probably spent some time with the 5-paragraph essay, which is a good model, nothing wrong with it, but the CDW model makes the structure of an argument more clear. And by argument, I'm using the word the way philosophers do. I mean, informally, people call disputes and contentions and fighting with each other as an argument, but arguments at their best aren't like that. Socrates again kind of exemplifies what you're doing in argument, which is using evidence and reason, trying to get at the truth. If you're doing anything else, I mean, Socrates would say you're misusing language. But he told one of his opponents that he invited correction. I mean, if he's wrong in what he's saying, please point out to me my error so that I can fix it. And if the correction was true, he would cheerfully change his mind and thank his opponent, because his goal wasn't to win, it was to think true thoughts. I might say just a little bit more about arguments. Why argue? Well, the first reason is to clarify thinking. Sometimes people aren't sure what they believe. I mean, if you're like me and like most people, on a lot of topics, you have kind of a muddled mass of feelings and attitudes and facts, but it isn't clear. And yet we all do face situations that require us to interpret fairly accurately what is really going on, and argument can help order things, put order to that mess of bubbling thoughts that we have inside our heads. We use arguments to explain actions or beliefs. People always have reasons for the things they do, but those reasons aren't always clear. Argument seeks to shed light on those reasons and make them explicit. And we use arguments to solve problems or to make judgment. The world is filled with controversies about how we should act, all with competing interests and evidence urging different directions. If you paid any attention to politics, you're probably very aware of the fact that arguments are urging us in all sorts of directions. But if we can systematically assess various factors in, making an argument for what we believe and why we believe it, that's very helpful. And then probably the most important reason, I think, people don't do things out of grim necessity for very long, and they don't do them very well, I think. But people do argue to have fun, and philosophers, of course, like to argue. Not in a way of having fights, but in a way of making their thinking clear or making their thinking more powerful. Participating in the clash of ideas can be intellectually stimulating. Most of the arguments that people have with friends and family are over relatively unimportant issues. They're doing it partly just for the fun of it. So let's jump into it. I said that Socrates is comes at the beginning of the great tradition, the great conversation of world philosophy. But of course, he didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of a very particular culture, that of ancient Greece. And something extremely important happened in ancient Greece about 300 years before Socrates, and that was this right here, a poet named Homer. He's about 750 BC. Plato, I mean, misspelled there, but Plato comes here in the classical period. But so from about 800 BC to about 500 BC, there's about 300 years roughly. We don't really know when Homer lived exactly. We kind of guess. But what Homer did was he told stories about the the war that Greece had fought with Troy centuries before. And the poems he wrote were the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in some ways, those stories, the poems, epic poems of Homer, were just classical war stories. That when warriors come home in a warrior society, they will brag about their exploits and tell stories about what they experienced. And Homer does that, but the stories he told were strange in some ways, and they captured people's imagination, or at least the ancient Greeks' imagination, and they they kept talking about Greece for about Homer for 300 years. I mean, and the reason is that he told stories that were a little unusual and that raised unsettling questions but didn't resolve them. And so when you finished listening to Homer, there was a lot to think about and a lot to argue about. And that's what the Greeks did for 300 years. I would say philosophy emerged largely through discussions about Homer. The stories that Homer told, those war stories, which were unusual. Like usually in a warrior story about his battle, he's usually the good guy. The enemy is the bad guy. But in the Iliad, the story about the war with Troy, probably the best guy, the most admirable guy in the story is Hector, who is the leading warrior for the Trojans, the other side. So that Homer was doing something different than simply passing on war stories. Um, I've given some of the significant. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this stuff or pass it on a test, but these big dates. Homer, about 750 BC. The death of Socrates, 399 BC, just roughly 400 BC, and then his student Plato, from 428 BC to 347 BC. And I'll come back to this when we really get to Socrates. I'm going to spend some time this class on Homer. But if you look at that date, the death of Socrates, 399, and this, the war, well, no, the Peloponnesian War, which was between two Greek colonies, Sparta and Athens, which Athens was destroyed, 404 BC. It's just, it's all happening right about at the end of Socrates' life. So let's just pay a little bit more attention to Homer for a little bit here. So let's pick up Homer when Odysseus and his men are on their way home from the Trojan War. The two big books that Homer is responsible for writing or gathering. We don't know how much he wrote and how much he just collected from the oral histories that were available among those Greek tribes. But the two big stories he tells are the Iliad, which is the story of the war that the Greeks had with Troy, and then the Odyssey, which is the story of Odysseus trying to get home from that Trojan War. The war lasted 10 years, and Odysseus's voyage home lasted 10 years because of some a lot of troubles that he had, which is largely what the Odyssey is about. So let's pick this story up. What I want to focus on is just some of the way that ideas circulate in Homer that, as I said, they present you with troubling situations without really resolving them. And one of the issues that's big in the Odyssey is the idea of hospitality. It was understood among the Greeks that you owed hospitality to a stranger. I mean, if in a world without hotels and motels and police and maps and all of that, I mean, being a stranger traveling through the world was dangerous and frightening, and the Greeks made it was part of their religion that you had to welcome strangers and feed them and take care of them. The understanding was that any stranger that you meet might be one of the gods in disguise. Maybe it was Apollo or Athena. And if you mistreated a stranger, you were maybe mistreating the gods, which you didn't want to do. Um, but something else to keep in mind, our word hospitality comes from the same root as our word for hostility. Hospitality and hostility are related concepts because what is a stranger? It may not be clear. Is the stranger a friend who I should take care of, or is it an enemy who maybe is um, deceiving me? So let's just pick up where I'm going to pick this is up is Odysseus and his men are lost at sea. They find land and they they go ashore. They find land and they find a cave and they go in, and what good luck! There's cheese and wine there. So let's pick the story up. The video clips I'm using come from a 1997 Hallmark miniseries, The Odyssey. It took me weeks to get a copy. Now it's available free on YouTube. Okay, so there's a sample of a section of Homer. Notice that Polyphemus, the Cyclops, is depicted as a creature without law or custom. He doesn't respect the traditions of men. Hospitality and what you owe people on the road is very much on the mind of Odysseus and his men, but not Polyphemus. Men don't eat men, Odysseus tells him. Cyclops do, Polyphemus answers. And then at the end, I mean, a lot of critics think that Odysseus is troubled. This is at the beginning of his journey home from Troy back to his homeland in Ithaca, Greece. And what Odysseus yells from the boat once he thinks he's out of range of the Cyclops is, I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, whose home is in Ithaca. And I, not nobody, the fake name he had given him. So he's, Polyphemus is outside his cave yelling, nobody hurt me, nobody blinded me. It's kind of a joke. I don't know what it sounded like in the original Greek language. But Odysseus goes on and says, I have done this to you. I, Odysseus, have done this to you. And basically, even your father can't help you now. Well, his father is Poseidon, the god of the sea. And one reading of this story is that Odysseus commits the sin of hubris, of excessive pride, of not accepting the part that's due to a man and trying to take on the part that is due to a god, to Poseidon. And so his 10 years of trouble getting home are punishment for his dismissive attitude towards a god. Hubris, Hubris, classical sin among excessive pride, sin among the Greeks. But notice largely this story is about hospitality and what is owed, what are the limits. But notice that Odysseus and his men enter the home uninvited. They do have some gifts, but they do just come in without being invited. They help themselves to wine and cheese. They lounge on Polyphemus's sheepskins. And Odysseus thinks that the customs, the traditions, the law of men, the hospitality requires Polyphemus to offer them food and shelter. And he's offended that Polyphemus gets angry with them and decides, and Odysseus and his men decide anything is fair once Polyphemus eats a crew member and then imprisons them in his cave. Um, but to see kind of how Homer works, how his stories work on people, is let's contrast that moment in the Cyclops cave, with with a different moment, or a series of moments in the play. What's going on all through the play is the issue of hospitality is getting some pressure kind of back at home. And what's going on is Odysseus has been gone now for 20 years. He left behind a wife and a child. His wife, Penelope, a beautiful woman. Uh, he was a king in Ithaca, so extensive lands and livestock and, a palace. And other men have come in. I mean, Odysseus is gone. They want the land, they want the livestock, and they want Penelope. Um, and they bring gifts, these men, the suitors they're called, because they're pursuing the favor of Penelope. They're seeking to marry Penelope and take over Odysseus's kingdom. They've moved into his house. Penelope notes that they are guests who have brought gifts, and so she tells Telemachus, who was a child when Odysseus left, but he's approaching 20 years old now. He's a young man. Penelope tries to teach him that the customs of hospitality require her to accept the gifts and to share with the men who've come to her home. That's the law of tradition. But, but, are there limits to that? I mean, at some point, like when Polyphemus eats one of us, are we freed from the rules of being a good um, guest? Well, as I said, the story raises questions that the story doesn't actually resolve. Um, so let's look at. So this is back at Odysseus's home, and we'll just get a glimpse of what's going on in his absence. And the young Telemachus is the guy on screen right now, Odysseus's son, who is coming into his manhood. And that means beginning to take responsibility for or face the problems of what's going on in his father's kingdom. So that's Telemachus and Penelope back home. And you can see that Homer is putting pressure on the whole idea of hospitality. It's required of us. Our traditions, our culture demands it, and yet there's a lot to think about here. I mean, it's not clear. Obviously, Penelope and Telemachus have different ideas about what should happen at this moment. Penelope is still very interested in teaching Telemachus the culture, including the requirement of being hospitable to people who come to your home offering you gifts. So let's check back in with Odysseus. He's continuing his wandering, and at one point he visits the underworld. The Greeks didn't really have a heaven or a hell. They didn't believe in that, but they had an underworld, a kind of a shadowy, dark place that people went to after this life. And I said that these were epic poems. Epic has a definition in literature, and there are several things that a piece of literature needs to do to be epic, but one of them is that it presents like an encyclopedic overview of the whole culture, knowledge of the people out of whom that literature springs. And all epic poems, at some point, the hero visits the dead, visits wherever the dead go after this life. It's typically Greek that no heaven or no hell, that the world beyond this life is very shadowy to the Greeks. the Greeks, more than any people in the ancient world, loved this life. They they invented Olympic Games. I mean, they were the first people maybe to play on a huge scale. They invented democracy. Their gods were all modeled on human beings. They looked like humans. They weren't the monsters with a body of a eagle and head of a lion and all that stuff that the Egyptians and surrounding cultures had. They so what do the dead do in the underworld? They're mostly still preoccupied with what went on and is going on in the world of the living. The real center stage in Greek reality is this life, mortality. But at any point, at any rate, Odysseus goes to the underworld, and there he gets some information from his mother, who he didn't even know was dead until he ran into her in the underworld. So let's have a look at that. Well, that's about an hour. I'm not really finished. I'm right in the middle of the points that I wanted to make, but I have a feeling that some of you are probably finished. Stopping in the middle of things is actually a good place to stop, I think. So we'll leave it there. Penelope is faithfully waiting. Telemachus has become a man and is beginning to challenge the suitors who were there. And Odysseus's home place has been invaded by a horde of barbarians who are wasting his substance and trying to sleep with his wife. So that's the situation. What you see in that last scene, that tree, that oak tree that was, or maybe it's an olive tree, I don't remember, but that tree that Odysseus carved into the main post for his wedding bed with Penelope is a symbol of one of the other major themes going on in the work. And it's useful to keep in mind that although I'm talking about hospitality to make a particular point, there the Iliad and the Odyssey are long, complicated works, and there's a lot more going on than addressing hospitality. For example, the connection between marriage and family and particular places, the way that tree is rooted in the soil of Ithaca, and that's very symbolic of Odysseus' marriage to Penelope, and it's really related to other themes, like just before Odysseus manages to get home, he's living with a goddess, she's immortal, and she loves Odysseus, and she promises that if he will stay with her on her enchanted isle, he will be immortal. He will live with this beautiful goddess forever. And yet he doesn't choose that. He chooses mortality. He chooses Penelope. He chooses to go home to this woman who, like him, is aging and who will eventually die. Something to think about, and I'll come back to that theme. Like if you were offered the chance to live for 1,000 years, would you take it or would you pass? Okay, we'll leave it there. I'll most of the assignments this week I will try to, in this course, I will try to have them due on Wednesday, and I'll talk more soon, or I'll post on the Schoolology website what the assignments and expectations are. Welcome. I look forward to meeting you all, and we'll see you next time.